All right, we're gonna go ahead and get started. First of all, the upcoming courses, Lent with the Director, Mondays, both a morning and an evening session, 9 a.m. to 10 p.m. and then 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. March 7th, 14th, 21st, $30 registration fee. These are all new talks from last year, so it's not just a repeat of that material. And there is a homework pass for biblical catechetical students. Let us begin, as always, in prayer in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Great are you, O Lord, and exceedingly worthy of praise. Your power is immense and your wisdom beyond reckoning. And so we humans, who are a due part of your creation, long to praise you. We who carry our mortality about with us, carry the evidence of our sin, and with it the proof that you thwart the proud. Yet these humans, due part of your creation as they are, still do long to praise you. You stir us so that praising you may bring us joy, because you have made us and drawn us to yourself, and our heart is unquiet until it rests in you. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, so tonight we have Augustine's conversion. If you signed up for a class on Augustine's Confessions, this is probably the lecture that you were looking forward to. The fantastic description that Augustine gives us of his own conversion in the Garden of Milan. That's going to come at the very, very end of the lecture, of course. So there's 2 hours to get us there, 2 more hours of Augustine and the divided self. I mean, we've talked about it. Well, I've talked about it. You've listened nonstop for the last 3 weeks about the sense of psychological fragmentation, the divided self that is Augustine, that wants to do one thing, ends up not doing it, ends up doing something that he does not want to do, that causes him pain and that he knows will cause him pain. The essential nature of the human condition. Genuine conversion, of course, is never just that immediate single brilliant insight. In Augustine's case, this is something that, in a sense, he's been preparing for 10 years. In a sense, he's been preparing for it ever since he was 11 years old, falls sick, wants baptism, and can't understand why that baptism is being denied to him. Before he can get there, he has that one major final obstacle that, as we've gone over the last couple of lectures, the opposition that he had to Christianity, that intellectual haughtiness that he got from the Manichaeans, that Christianity was somehow unworthy of his efforts. He's gotten over that. He's learned through the example of St. Ambrose and Ambrose's teaching to see the real beauty in Christianity, to see the intellectual substance to Christianity, that it's not the character that the Manichaeans made it out to be. But he still has this problem of evil and its source, and God as the nature of God. And these are the 2 questions that are tied to his belief in materialism. That belief that all that is real is what we can experience with our senses. So in this first book, Augustine's going to overcome that roadblock. And then in book 8, he's going to have, I guess we could say, it's almost as though the plane is preparing for descent. That's the first half of book 8. And that's going to be a bumpy landing. But we do end with everything being put into place and his conversion occurring with that brilliant insight, that moment of grace in the garden. I just want to make sure that we don't imagine that it was just a singular moment, and it wasn't, as Augustine sees later, God preparing a lifetime of bringing Augustine back to himself. Okay, so first part that we're looking at, Confessions 7, paragraph or section 1 through 16, materialism and its discontents and Neoplatonism. How does Augustine get past this belief that he has of, he wants to imagine, we saw last time, imagining God as a corporal being extending out into space. And we'll read his opening line here. By now, my misspent, impious adolescence was dead, and I was entering the period of youth. But as I advanced in age, I sank ignobly into foolishness, for I was unable to grasp the idea of substance except as something we can see with our bodily eyes. So when Augustine talks about going out of adolescence and the period of his youth, adolescence up until the last 100 years has been considered the period of man's life that goes from the full development of puberty up until about age 30. And there's a lot of wisdom in seeing things that way, that men, even in their late 20s, have much more in common with 18-year-olds than they do with 35-year-olds in terms of emotional development. And so what Augustine's acknowledging is here, as he turns 30, he's entering into the phase of his life. And youth here refers to being a young man as opposed to being an old man. So this is the period where it's time to put away the passions and ignorance of youth, but he can't do that yet because he still has this unable to grasp the idea of substance except as something we can see with our bodily eyes. And if you know anybody, I'm sure you do, the question is, have you discussed with them people who are materialists? Because that's the overwhelming consensus of reality amongst Western culture right now, that all that really exists is the material world. The questions that they might have about religion are very curious, because they're bound to this belief that's all that's really there is what we can see and sense. The best example of this, just showing how absurd it can be taken, was a tabloid headline I remember from 10 years ago, where it talked about doctors measuring an incredibly minor difference in body weight after the moment of death. And this was supposed to prove the existence of a soul. But that could only prove the existence of a soul if you believe in a material soul. If you believe in a soul as spiritual substance, that whole idea is nonsense. But that's the world that Augustine is living in, what I would associate now with tabloid headlines of how can you view religion if you can't understand the concept of spiritual reality. And this puts a huge dent in his ability to understand God. From the core of my being, I believe you to be imperishable, inviolable, and unchangeable. Because although I did not understand why or how this could be, I saw quite plainly and with full conviction that anything perishable is inferior to what is imperishable. And I unhesitatingly reckoned the inviolable higher than anything subject to violation, and what is constant and unchanging better than what can be changed. So we have this concept of positive theology here, that the attributes of God are the absolute maximum of good attributes. So God does not have the defects of material reality. But of course, if you're understanding God in a materialistic way, these concepts are just irreconcilable. And that's, of course, what Augustine experienced. My heart cried out in vehement protest against all the phantom shapes that thronged my imagination. And I strove with this single weapon to beat away from the gaze of my mind the cloud of filth that hovered round me. But hardly had I got rid of it than another twinkling of an eye, it was back again, clotted together, invading and clouding my vision, so that even though I was no longer hampered by the image of a human body, I was still forced to imagine that something corporeal spread out in space, whether infused into the world or even diffused through the infinity outside of it. This was still the case, even though I recognized that this substance was imperishable, inviolable, and immutable. So he's imagining this kind of perfection, but as he's trying to picture it, he's trying to picture it in material terms. And as soon as you start picturing the perfections that you attribute to God in material terms, you end up with nonsense, which is what he's struggling with. Whatever was not stretched out in space, paragraph 2, or diffused or compacted or inflated or possessed of some such qualities, or at least capable of possessing them, I judge to be nothing at all. So anything that he can't consider in terms of concrete reality, he just dismisses as non-existent. But he can't put this together with the conceptions of God that he has. And he lets us know, I held on to this view only because I was unable to think in any other way. He knows that what he believes in, the way that he views the world, he knows there's something horribly wrong with the world, with his worldview, because everything that he believes about God, and he has absolute faith in God at this point. He never questions the existence of God. His question is, how can God exist in the way that I believe he does, given the way that I see the world, which is this material way? So he can argue against others. He has no problem dismissing the Manichaeans. I had sufficient argument against the self-deceived deceivers who were dumb because your word did not send them forth. I had a sufficient argument, one which Nebridius had been wont to propose ever since our day in Carthage, which left us all shaken who had heard it. Those so-called powers of darkness, whom they postulate, and these are the Manichaeans here. And there was a question that I had in email this week that was referring to some of the comments that we had in the article at the back of the book that I suggested, the one that's on, I think, page 465, about reading Confessions as Augustine's first treatise on grace. And on 469, there's a sentence that if evil is the absence of existence and goodness, the source of evil is a prior goodness, a preceding being. And then physical evil is the absence of good that should be present, and moral evil is the perversity of will. We could get to what Augustine means by that a little bit later. But what we have to understand is where he's coming from originally. And where he's coming from originally is the material belief in evil. That if you can imagine material as just like some black viscous substance that inhabits your body, something that's, you know, appropriate to like a Marvel comic book movie. That is the view of evil that the Manichaeans, that the dualists have. They believe that actual material is in and of itself evil and the source of evil. It's almost, if you could imagine, a moral equivalent of kryptonite. That this thing exists and simply being around it is enough to make you bad as well. But it's a physical substance, and that's what the Manichaeans would hold, and that's what Augustine knows is wrong, but he can't quite figure out how to disprove it. So what he comes to in 7.3 here, that we're just going to go through very quickly here, are some of the philosophical absurdities that a materialist belief in evil encounters. And as I'd said in 4, I declared and firmly believe that you, our God, our true God, who made not only our souls but our bodies too, are subject to no defilement or alteration, and in all respects unchangeable. So he believes all of these things of God, that God is omnipotent, God is immutable. The problem that he has in the universe isn't that he wants to circumscribe God's powers. Yet even so, I was still convinced that the cause of evil had not been clarified or disentangled. Without having the understanding of spiritual reality, he can't resolve the problem of the origin of evil. He's just stuck with this gross, this horribly basic material idea of evil that the Manichaeans have, and he can't figure out a way around that. I strained to see myself the truth of an explanation I had heard, 5 here, that the cause of evil is the free decision of our will, in consequence of which we act wrongly and suffer your righteous judgment. But I could not see it clearly. And how evil can be something that has its source not in material reality, but in a human decision. is something that makes no sense without understanding of spiritual reality. Spiritual reality is absolutely a necessity for believing in free will and the sense of blame and credit. It just doesn't work otherwise. The best attempt at that was probably by Lucretius in his On the Nature of Things, to try to come up with a system where you can have free will and materialism. And it just does not work at all. And that's where Augustine is right here. So going through this very quickly so that we can get to the end where he discovers the Neoplatonists. I was seeking the origin of evil, but seeking in an evil way, and failing to see the evil inherent in my search itself. It's evil because he's trying to put the cause of evil as part of creation. If he's acknowledging that God is the creator of everything and he wants to believe that evil is a material reality, he would have to assume that God is the cause of evil. And so that's the seeking it in the evil way and failing to see the evil inherent in my search itself, attributing evil to God's causation rather than to the result of the natural result of this spiritual reality. He finally rejects astrology. We're going to go over this because there's just so much to get through tonight. Astrology is another one of those attempts at explaining the universe that we saw in the second lecture, was appealing to it momentarily, even though he had very little respect for a lot of its practitioners. The arguments against it, maybe we'll come back to this later. We come back to him still searching, still trying to work through the problem of all of this. And we come to the solution in book 13. He reads the books of the Platonists. So he's talking about them as Platonists in modern philosophical terms. For about the last 1,000 years, they're known as Neoplatonists. So this isn't Plato's doctrine directly. This is Plato as interpreted by the philosopher Plotinus, who was writing in the 3rd century. But he wasn't really writing. He was coming up with these ideas. Almost all of Plotinus's ideas were put into their form by Plotinus's disciple Porphyry. And so then Plotinus and Porphyry are the two greatest Neoplatonist thinkers that we have. And, Plotinus being the originator, Porphyry being the one that writes everything down. The system that the Neoplatonists have is that there is what they call the one. There is a God responsible for everything. And he's known as the monad, which is just one. And then in a process that's described as emanation, from the one you have mind, or noia. So mind is this emanation from the one. It's distinct from the one. It's dependent on the one. But as mind, you can see some sort of parallelism between the second emanation being mind or noia and Christ as logos, the second person of the Trinity. There's a huge difference between them, however. And then off of mind, you then have a third emanation, which is known as soul or psyche. So you have the one, mind, and soul, and that's the Neoplatonic. I won't call it a trinity because it's not. It's a triad. The monad is absolutely above the other two. They are not equal in any way. Mind is less than the monad, and soul is less than mind and the monad. But it's this sense of looking at the universe where everything comes from a single creator. Mind comes out of that, and then finally soul. And then the soul, some certain parallelisms you can find between the Neoplatonic soul and the Holy Spirit. The Neoplatonists are also, this is where he's going to get the concept of spiritual substance, because the Neoplatonists are not materialists the way that the Manichaeans Everything, because this is the Platonic background, we think of those Platonic ideals, Plato's idea that what we see in the world around us is just a gross material copy of a more perfect idea that exists in this realm of forms. The realm of forms for Plato is a spiritual reality that exists in a non-physical sense. And this is what Augustine is able to get from the Neoplatonists. He's reading these works, which had just been translated into Latin maybe 30 years earlier. And they're translated into Latin by Marius Victorinus, who is somebody who's working with Simplicianus, who Augustine talks to then in book 8. And I mentioned Simplicianus in the email that I sent out. Probably the most influential Christian of the patristic age that nobody outside of patristic scholars has ever heard of. He has a huge influence on Ambrose. He's sort of Ambrose's guiding priest figures. Ambrose is figuring out how to be a bishop. He ends up writing to Augustine, and he writes Augustine some questions, and this is included, the history of this is included in that little article that I recommended that you read at the back of the book. In 396, after Augustine's been made a bishop, Simplicianus sends some questions to him about Paul's epistle to the Romans and the question of grace. And it's one of those beautiful moments where he meets Augustine where he is. Augustine is, this intellect. He's been trained to teach and respond to questions. So Simplicianus gets him thinking about grace by asking him questions about grace. And the questions that he asks him lead Augustine to recognize the effect of grace in his own life. And so one of the scholarly ideas about confessions is that it's written in response to Paulinus of Nola's questions about Alypius and whatnot, but the formulation of the larger bit where Augustine is going through his life and seeing the hand of God working even when he couldn't recognize it himself, that this is due to the influence of Simplicianus asking these questions about grace and Augustine really coming to terms with what grace means and recognizing it then in his own life story. And all of this brings us back to the Platonists that Victorinus, who we'll talk about in Confessions 8, was very sympathetic to these Neoplatonists. Neoplatonism, it has a very privileged history in philosophy. Of all of the ancient philosophies, it's the philosophy that seems to work best with Christianity, which is ironic because Plotinus and Porphyry both despised Christians. But it's the philosophy that Christian philosophers later on would recognize as having sort of a shadowy sense of what is true. And we get this for the very first time with Augustine. So section 13 here, in the books of the Platonists, I read, not that the same words were used, but precisely the same doctrine was taught, buttressed by many and various arguments, that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, he was God. He was with God in the beginning, everything was made through him, nothing came to be without him. What was made is alive with his life, and that light was the light of humankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has never been able to master it. So the just beautiful opening to the Gospel of John can very easily be read in a Neoplatonic light, and Augustine is the first of many. After Augustine, the Neoplatonic way of reading it is probably the dominant way for, or at least the next 700 years. So he's able to see the similarities between Neoplatonism and the opening of John. But then he goes through what he doesn't find in Neoplatonism, but that God, the Word, is the true light, which illumines every human person who comes into this world, and that he was in this world, a world made by him, but the world did not know him, but that he came into his own home, and his own people did not receive him. But to those who did receive him, he gave power to become children of God, to those, that is, who believe his name. None of this did I read there. Neoplatonism utterly rejected the concept of incarnation, that mind could take on physical form, would want to take on physical form and come into the world of concrete materiality. That's a notion that Plotinus and Porphyry both just rejected as abhorrent to their idea, that spiritual reality is on the far end, it's the noblest form, that to come down to, and this is where Neoplatonism isn't dualistic or materialist in the way that Manichaeism is, but it's dualist in another way, in that there's a spiritual realm that is good and the material realm is far, far below that. And originally in Neoplatonism, the material world is just below the spiritual world. But later on, a lot of Neoplatonists will see the material world as being itself evil because it's material. For the Neoplatonists, though, for God to condescend to come down into the world is just something that they couldn't fathom. I also read in them that God, the Word, was born not of blood, nor man's desire, nor lust of the flesh, but of God. But that the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. I did not read there. That he emptied himself and took on the form of a slave, and being made in the likeness of men, was found in human form. That he humbled himself and was made obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross, which is why God raised him from the dead and gave him a name above every other name, so that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven, on earth, or in the underworld, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, in the glory of God the Father. Of this, no mention was made in the books, because of course this is the limit of Neoplatonism. That God should come into the world in the incarnation is absurd. That he should come into the world in the most ignoble way possible, and then suffer the most ignoble death, is something that just horrified Plotinus and Porphyry. I did read in them that your only begotten Son, co-eternal with you, abides before all ages and above all ages, and that of his fullness our souls receive to become blessed thereby, and that by participation in that wisdom which abides in itself, they are made new in order to become wise. So this is key in Neoplatonism, is that our souls need to go back out to the one mind soul, because all of this is on that higher plane of existence. The Neoplatonists believe that the human soul is trapped in flesh, and that to live the good life is to overcome the limitations of flesh, the limitations of temptation, to overcome all of that and to give yourself over to intellectual contemplation of that spiritual reality. For the Neoplatonists, that is the goal of life. And the Neoplatonists talk about ecstatic meditation, I guess we would call it. You are so into contemplation of the divine nature, that it's as though you it is a transcendent experience, that your body is no longer a concern at all, and that your spirit actually creates union with the one, with mind, with soul. So that's the whole point of Neoplatonism, is to establish this divine union. So he finds that idea of salvation, that our souls long to return to God, and are capable of that. He finds that in the Neoplatonists, but that at the time of our weakness, he died for the wicked, that you did not spare even your only son, but delivered him up for us all. These things are not to be found there. So Augustine gives us this fantastic delineation of what we can take from the Neoplatonists, but also what those real limitations are. And he recognizes in the Neoplatonists the same kind of intellectual pride that he found in the Manichaeans. Of course, in the case of the Neoplatonists, their intellectual pride is somewhat deserved because they have just a much better philosophical system. But on the other hand, because their philosophical system is so much better, their pride is even worse. Because they come so close to knowing and recognizing God. They come so close to knowing and recognizing the true God, but they fall just short. And in front of the Logos, in front of the Word made flesh, they can only see an absurd doctrine. So the Manichaeans came nowhere close to this, so their pride is childish in a sense. The Neoplatonic pride is so much worse because they come so close to truth. As for those who are raised on the stilts of their loftier doctrine, too high to hear him calling, learn of me, for I am gentle and humble of heart, and you shall find rest for your souls. Augustine's entire search throughout all of this to find rest for his soul. Even if they know God, they do not honor him as God or give him thanks. In claiming to be wise, they have become stupid. Section 15. In consequence, what I also read there was the story of their exchanging your glorious imperishable nature for idols and a variety of man-made things, for the effigy of a perishable human or birds of crawling creatures. These are the food of the Egyptians. And then we come into, and this is a theme that's dear to Augustine, and it comes to what use should the Christian make of philosophy? And the answer is found in what's called the despoiling of the Egyptians. That bit where, and my favorite part about Exodus is how much more interesting the actual story is than the way that it's usually told. The usual telling of Exodus, we get rid of all of the details that are more complicated. One of the last details is that as Pharaoh is looking around and all of the firstborn in the land are dead, the people are starting to hate him because he's being so obstinate, and he begs the Egyptians to leave. Moses then demands that they be given gifts before they leave. And so they do up a collection, and all of the rich families of Egypt just pile up gold and precious gems and metals for the Hebrews. So this despoiling of the Egyptians is read allegorically by Augustine as it's legitimate for Christians to take the wisdom of the pagans, to take the parts of their philosophy, the parts of Neoplatonism that come so close to God, and make use of that. Because this wisdom of the philosophers is a kind of false wisdom. They are, in a sense, unjust possessors of this wisdom because they don't take it as far as they should. This wisdom doesn't bring them to know God as God is and to give him thanks. And so after all of this, Augustine makes an attempt at Platonic ecstasy, that is the meditating upon the one. And he comes close. With the vision of my spirit, such as it was, I saw in the incommutable light far above my spiritual ken, transcending my mind, not this common light, which every carnal eye can see, nor any light of the same order, but greater, as though this common light were shining much more powerfully, far more brightly, and so extensively as to fill the universe. So he's seeing here the divine light. But he doesn't get it all, because the way that he's seeing it right now, there's something missing, and what's missing is Christ. Okay, so at this point, we'll take a couple of minutes. If you have questions, please put them into chat. So in chat right now, and then I have a couple of questions from this week on emails that I'll also go through. Isn't Augustine unfairly harsh and judgmental in condemning those who believe what he had formerly believed? Especially since he struggled and could not see the nature of evil. So, I mean, it depends on what you mean by harsh. Judgmental, yeah, absolutely, he's being judgmental. But he's being judgmental for a purpose, because the people who believed what he believed aren't ultimately getting at truth. It's something that our present cultural moment doesn't like to hear, but truth is Christ. Anything that falls short of Christ is not full truth. And so Augustine is not going to say, they did the best they can, they're really good people, they deserve something like that, because that's not what the Gospels say. And this is something else that'll turn into an issue for Augustine. And this references another question that I had. Christ is pretty clear that salvation comes from him alone, that you have to come to Christ. Anything short of that, this suggestion that, it just sort of matters what your intention is, it's a nice idea. But the problem with it being a nice idea is that it's just utterly refuted by the Gospels themselves. And so when Augustine finally comes to this understanding, as he will in the second half of our lecture on Confession 7, anything, to suggest that these people are, they're doing the best they can and they're okay, is to suggest that they're incapable of coming to truth, or that they don't need to. And that in itself is it's an acceptance that is empty, because it allows people to wallow contentedly in something that is, in what is less than what they were intended for. God creates the human soul and wants the human soul to go back to him. Any philosophical system we accept that makes that impossible is one that is not good for us. Any philosophical system that keeps us from coming back to God is, by Augustine's definition, sinful in the sense that it substitutes something else for God. Along those lines, there was a question about Augustine and Pelagius. So Pelagius was probably an Irish, not a monk, but an ascetic. He wasn't a cleric. And he ends up in Rome around the year 400, 411 is when the councils come to a head. And what Pelagius was teaching, and Pelagius is fairly important. I found this. I'll put into chat the article on Pelagius that's from the Catholic Encyclopedia on newadvent.org, which is one of my favorite sites. The Catholic Encyclopedia it has is from 1911. So, it's kind of limited in terms of anything modern. But when we're talking about, things that happened in the 4th and 5th century, it's up to date on that. So Pelagius is a severe ascetic. Even Augustine, who disagreed with everything that Pelagius said, respected him personally as a man of, he calls him a saintly man. Nobody doubted Pelagius's sincerity. But in an odd way, Pelagius's own asceticism and his own moral rigor ends up becoming his downfall. What Pelagius was teaching, basically, which is very modern in a sense, is that there is no original sin. That what happened in the garden is that Adam set a bad example for humanity, and that sin is universal because humanity follows Adam's example, but that there isn't anything that stains all of humanity with original sin. For the same reason, then, if all of us aren't stained by original sin, then the question is, what was the point of Christ's sacrifice? Why was it necessary for Christ to die on a cross? And Pelagius's answer to that is, it tends more towards it's a teaching example. It shows us all how to, give everything over to God, to even give our life up for that. But for Pelagius, the sacrifice on the cross was not a redemptive act that generally saved humanity from a state of sin. He's very influenced by Stoicism and the sense of the will that exists in Stoicism. Like, you could probably sum up Pelagius's ideas. This is kind of crude, but this is Pelagianism. Suck it up and sin no more is Pelagius's idea. That the individual human will is enough to overcome sin. That's his point. And it sounds great for a moment. Augustine knows that this is false because, he's been spending 20 years, and Augustine had pretty solid willpower, but not enough to overcome sin. And the question here is one of grace. That Pelagius, by overemphasizing human will and the human ability to do good, grace isn't necessary. He doesn't see humanity as being in a state of essential sin. He sees humanity in need of better lessons, and better willpower. And what Augustine comes up with grace is the sense of, no, you don't. What you need is reliance on God. And God's reliance is not something that you can choose. God extends the grace to us and we can respond positively to it. But ultimately, it's not Augustine's choice to go back to God. It was God's desire that Augustine return to him. It's not through Augustine's will that he does. It's that at a certain point in time, he responds positively to God's grace. If there's more questions, we'll deal with those at the next break. I don't want to fall too far behind and then have to, shortchange book 8. So moving then into Confessions 7:16 through 27. What we have here now is, with Augustine's understanding from the Neoplatonists, he has the ability to resolve the question of evil, but this is still insufficient. So what we saw at the end just a couple seconds ago, he attempted Platonic ecstasy, that is to reach God through contemplation. He gets a brief vision of this light, but it isn't enough. Your rays beamed intensely upon me, section 16, beating back my feeble gaze, and I trembled with love and dread. I knew myself to be far away from you in a region of unlikeness, and I seemed to hear your voice from on high. I am the food of the mature. Grow then, and you will eat me. You will not change me into yourself like bodily food. You will be changed into me. And I recognized that you have chastened man for his sin and caused my soul to dwindle away like a spider's web. And I said, is truth then a nothing simply because it is not spread out through the space, either finite or infinite? Then from afar you cried to me, by no means, for I am who am. So he has this attempt at union with the divine. It fails in a region of unlikeness. And what he hears the voice of God, he believes. But it's a God that demands humility, that you will not change me into yourself like bodily food. And the Eucharistic overtones are absolutely intentional here. You will be changed into me. The bread of angels that Augustine needs to feed upon is that which will change him into God, not something that will change God into something like him. And as he hears this, the problems of materialism disappear. That's that answer, I am who am, the name of God from Exodus, which Christ echoes throughout the Gospels, I am. Augustine takes on this, and no possibility of doubt remained to me. I could more easily have doubted that I was alive than that truth exists, truth that is seen and understood through the things that are made. So this is the spiritual reality that he's able to understand now, that the truth does exist. All of the idea of the skeptics, that other group of Platonists that were appealing to him before, that truth is unknowable, that's gone. There is truth out there, and it's seen and understood through things that are made, through the material world, but it transcends that. And so now he has an ability to go back to the problem of evil. And this will bring us back to one of the other questions that came up, which I quoted earlier from the shorter reading that I gave you on page 469. Evil is the absence of existence in goodness. The source of evil is a prior goodness. Physical evil is the absence of that good. Accepting the spiritual reality, Augustine no longer needs the crass idea of material evil. Contemplating other things below you, section 17, I saw that they do not in the fullest sense exist. So everything in the created world, nor are they yet complete non-beings, for they are real because they are from you, but unreal inasmuch as they are not what you are. For that alone truly is which abides unchangingly. God is being. God's essential nature is to be. I am who am. Everything else that exists, from the highest spiritual creatures to physical reality around us exists because God creates it. And create, using that verb in the present tense, is intentional. Creation is not a one-time act in the historical past, because for God there is no historical past. Creation is not an event, but a metaphysical state, that we are all, God creates us, and so we exist. We do not exist independent of God. And that's what Augustine is getting at here. They are unreal in as much as they are not what you are. God is being itself. We have our being from God. We are utterly dependent at every moment of our being on the fact that God creates us. It was made further clear to me, 18, that things prone to destruction are good, since this destructibility would be out of the question if they were either that supremely good or not good at all. Because if they were supremely good, they would be indestructible. Whereas if they were not good at all, there would be nothing in them that could be destroyed. Destruction is obviously harmful, yet it can only do harm. Yet it can do harm only by diminishing good. For things to exist, they exist because God creates them. God does not create evil. So when we see things destroyed, whatever is destroyed is good, because if it was evil, it would not exist at all. All things which suffer harm are being deprived of some good. This conclusion is beyond cavil. If, however, they lose their good, they will not exist at all. For if they were to continue in existence without being any longer subject to destruction, they would be better because permanently indestructible. And what could be more outrageous than to declare them better for having lost everything that was good in them? It follows that as long as they do exist, they are good. A really, really convoluted way of coming back to the reality of God creating everything. They're not being an evil God that creates the evil things, but they're being God that creates everything, and everything that God creates is good, which leads us to everything that exists is good. So evil, the source of which I was seeking, cannot be a substance, because if it were, it would be good. Either it would be an indestructible substance, and that would mean it was very good indeed, or it would be a substance liable to destruction, but then it would not be destructible unless it was good. I saw then, for it was made clear to me, that you have made all good things, and that there are absolutely no substances that you have not made. Everything that God makes is good. God makes all substances. I saw too that you have not made all things equal. They all exist because they are severally good, but collectively very good. And the good and very good there, we'll get into this when Augustine talks about creation in Genesis. Seeing that which is very good, seeing that which is good. For our God has made all things exceedingly good. For you, evil has no being at all. And this is true not only of yourself, but of everything you have created, since apart from you, there is nothing that could burst in and disrupt the order you have imposed upon it. So evil is not something coming in from the outside. It has to do with the thing that itself that is created. Since my soul, and now we're skipping ahead a bit to 20, since my soul did not dare to find my God displeasing, it was unwilling to admit that anything that displeased it was truly yours. This was why it had strayed into believing in a duality of substances, but there it found no rest and only mouthed the opinion of others. So Augustine doesn't want to believe that God in any of his actions can be wrong, as creating evil would be, or displeasing. It was unwilling to admit that anything that displeased it was truly yours. God couldn't have intentionally created evil, which is displeasing. So the response that Augustine has is that, well, therefore, there has to be a duality of substances, and that evil substances somehow weren't created by God. But then that just raises up the question of what were they created by? What Augustine's getting at into all of this is that evil is not a thing, evil is a choice. I inquired then, section 22, what villainy might be, but I found no substance, only the perversity of a will twisted away from you, God, the supreme substance, toward the depths, a will that throws away its life within and swells with vanity abroad. The nature of evil then is not that there's a substance in the universe that's corrupting everything around it. The nature of evil is that God creates certain creatures with intelligence. He creates certain, out of his goodness, he wants creatures not as slaves that obey him because they have no choice. He wants creatures to love him. He wants creatures to choose him. But to choose him requires free will, and that requires the opportunity for those creatures to choose something other than God, to make something other than God the focus of their being. That in itself, for Augustine, is what evil is. It is the rejection of the creator for the creature. And that thought is, it's simple, but it's complicated the more that you think about it. And this is something that Augustine has thought about a lot. If we think then of, that line that was quoted earlier, that physical evil is the absence of good that should be present, moral evil is the perversity of will. If we think about the Garden of Eden, the serpent was not the source of evil that spread its evil to Adam and Eve. It's not as though the serpent infected Adam and Eve with something, and now they turned evil. The source of evil was Adam and Eve freely choosing to listen to the serpent and to accept what the serpent offered. And the serpent offered them the one thing that they did not have with their original created near perfection in Eden. The one thing that they lacked in the Garden of Eden was equality with God. And that's what the serpent offered them. You surely will not die. Your eyes will be opened and you will know good and evil. You will be like gods. That's the one thing that Adam and Eve lacked. And Adam and Eve chose to act in this way rather than remaining obedient to God. So the source of evil there is not the serpent in a material sense. The source of evil there is the perversity of a will twisted away from you, God. The absurdity that Adam and Eve have in their belief that they can make themselves equal to God, they can become like gods, knowing good and evil, while being created beings. So this is what evil is. It's not a substance. It's not something that radiates some evil. It's not whatever metaphors that we have, a disease that's contagious and passing around. All of these material metaphors fail because you run into that problem of the reality of how can you have evil if you're imagining it to be a created thing, if you're imagining it to be a substance. Either God can't be omnipotent or he can't be loving. But if we take this new definition, that there is something that our minds have an aspect of this spiritual reality, which the free will calls for. The perversity of a will twisted away from you. If there's any line that you remember out of this part of Confessions, that's the one that it is. And this is where Augustine recognizes throughout everything that he was looking at earlier, The Manichaeans told him that he succumbed to his lustful temptations because there was actual evil within his body that had not been liberated. I'm sorry, there was the good in his body hadn't been liberated from the evil, and the evil that was in his body was pushing him in this direction, which was very flattering because then Augustine didn't have to blame himself for these failings. He had simply failed to conquer evil. If you're imagining that there is this substance of evil, there's no shame in being unable to conquer the great, terrible force of the universe. There is shame for Augustine in having to acknowledge that what was evil was his own will. He wanted to live differently, but he always caved into the perversity of this because he felt in all of those moments, even though he knew that succumbing to lustful temptations would not bring him the happiness that he was seeking, in those moments, he still caved into it. He was trying to find the summum bonum, is the Latin term for that highest good, that good that once you have it, it satisfies you completely, that can only be found in God. That's what the addict, whatever the addiction is, that's what the addict continually does, is tries to find happiness in something that they know will not and cannot provide that. And in doing so, whatever that is, whether it's that drink, whether it's that drug, whether it's that sexual encounter, in that moment, you turn that experience into what God is. You believe that you're going to get satisfaction from that. So that's where this is, that perversity of a will twisted away from you, God, that God is the only source of that rest that we're looking for, that peace that we're looking for. You can't find it in other places. And we know that we can't, but we still do it because of that perversity of will. Uh, 23 then. I found it amazing that though I now loved your very self, and not some figment of imagination in place of you, that now he's able to imagine God stripped free from these material imaginations of some anthropomorphic being. I could not continue steadfastly in the enjoyment of my God. I was drawn toward you by your own beauty, but swiftly dragged away from you by my own weight, swept back headlong and groaning onto these things below myself. And this weight was carnal habit. So Augustine solved the problem of evil. What he has not solved, however, is his own vice. And this is the point where he reaches the limits of his philosophical inquiry, his philosophical search, and he recognizes the need for Christ. Accordingly, I looked for a way to gain the strength I needed to enjoy you, but I did not find it until I embraced the mediator between God and humankind, the man Christ Jesus. And this is the refutation of Pelagius here, who Pelagius wants us to have that our will is enough, that Christ is a good example and we can imitate that. And Augustine saying no, that mediator between God and humankind, the man Christ Jesus, who is also God, supreme over all things and blessed forever. Not yet had I embraced him, though he called out proclaiming, I am the way and the truth and the life. Nor had I known him as the food which, though I was not yet strong enough to eat it, he had mingled with our flesh. For the word became flesh so that your wisdom, through whom you created all things, might become for us the milk adapted to our infancy. Not yet was I humble enough to grasp the humble Jesus as my God, nor did I know what his weakness had to teach. And this is, sort of the completion of the philosophical journey that he's on, is he has to put away the pride of the philosophers and the inquiry of reason and the strength of will, and accept the humility of the man Jesus as God, and recognizing that only there do you have wisdom. And we come to the problem that he has. I took a different view at the time regarding Christ my Lord as no more than a man, though a man of excellent wisdom and without peer. So the modern idea of Christ as the guru, Christ as the good teacher, that was part of the ancient world as well. And that's the idea that Augustine has at this time. But I could not even begin to guess what a mystery was concealed in the Word made flesh. Um, and we come back to these misapprehensions that he had about the faith. And he includes what his friend Alypius. Alypius thought that Catholics believed God to be clothed in flesh in such a way that there was in Christ nothing else but Godhead in flesh. He did not think their preaching assigned to him a human soul or human consciousness. So the heresy that Christ has a human body, but only divinity, not a human soul, not a human nature. That's melded there. Later on, he recognized this error to be that of the Apollinarian heretics, and so he came to rejoice with Catholics in their faith and acquiescence. The question is going to be then, how does he come to the proper understanding of Christ? How does he recognize that the man Christ Jesus is the Logos? What he found so appealing about Neoplatonic teaching, but was that bridge that Neoplatonism couldn't make between their mind and humanity. And he finds this in St. Paul. It was therefore with intense eagerness, 27, that I seized on the hallowed calligraphy of your spirit, and most especially in the writings of the Apostle Paul. In earlier days, it had seemed to me that his teaching was self-contradictory and in conflict with the witness of the law and the prophets. But now, as these problems melted away, your chaste words presented a single face to me, and I learned to rejoice with reverence. So I began to read and discovered that every truth I had read in those other books was taught here also, but now inseparably from your gift of grace. So with Paul, he had the same problem from the Manichaeans that he had with Genesis, these superficial contradictions that someone like Ambrose was very easily able to point out as not being contradictory. And he recognizes in Paul the truth that he recognized in Neoplatonism, but he sees what Neoplatonism did not have, which is the gift of grace. What is a human wretch to do? Who will free him from this death-laden body, if not your grace given through Jesus Christ our Lord? None of this is to be found in those other books, the book of the Neoplatonists. So he's come to this fantastic, he's overcome his major problem, which had been materialism. But the limits of Neoplatonism are almost immediately apparent. The need for the man Christ Jesus to be the mediator between humanity and God, as he is literally the two natures. And he finds this understanding by reading the words of Paul and finding the fullness of truth within them. Okay, so then we're done with book 7. Quick break, couple of questions to go over here. So by undying truth, the question is, what does Augustine mean by that? He's referring to what we might call truth with a capital T, not just something that is sort of agreed upon by human convention, but the idea that there is a truth with a capital T that transcends, that exists independent of whether we assert it or not. So what I hear here is that Augustine was playing around in his mind with these things to help himself make sense of these differences based on all his past beliefs. There's nothing that can be placed in our way of thinking as such. Is that right? He seems so confused, so am I. So Augustine is, and this is one of those books where to really understand it, we would need a couple of lectures devoted just to book 7. You'd also probably need a course in Neoplatonism and materialist dualism. From his past beliefs, he's trying to recognize, and I guess maybe this is the question, what prevented him from accepting Jesus Christ? And he recognizes some of the issues that Christianity seems absurd to him, on the one hand, because of the way that the Manichaeans had taught him to read Genesis and then pointed out things with St. Paul. On the other hand, things that he had learned from philosophy, the the Platonic traditions, and there's a couple of them that he's looking at. Previously, the skeptics, who say the truth is unknowable entirely. Most of the Greek philosophical tradition is very hard to justify with Christianity. And there's a reason why St. Paul goes to Athens. He tells them, I have your unknown God, and the Athenians say, we're not quite ready today. The Greek philosophical tradition can't accept the idea of the incarnation. And without that, there's nothing in Christianity. So he's trying to make sense of a world of experiences of all of these 20 years of searching in different threads, trying to recognize what was it exactly that held me back? Where do I make progress? And this is one of those books where after this lecture, I'd encourage you to go back to read it slowly, to read it with the footnotes. The whole question of the reality of what he thought evil was, the philosophical absurdities that created. And also, how do we view evil? There's people in the world today that really want to believe that evil has this ontological existence, that it has this reality independent of what Augustine's presenting here as the choosing of anything other than God. So evil is present only if we choose it. It does not exist if the temptation is there or if the devil is present, but we do not consciously choose it. So evil here is the result of choosing something other than God. There's the temptation. Evil is very simply the choosing of anything other than God for our happiness. We're always seeking happiness, even if it's a perverted happiness, even if our souls are twisted and we find happiness in terrible things. We're choosing something that gives us delight on some level. So the question of evil being present is sort of it's not quite the way of phrasing it doesn't make sense. It's not so much present if we choose it as it is the effect of our choosing something other than God. When you choose something other than God, only suffering can be the result. We're created by God to return to him in love. If we choose to do anything else, there can only be suffering. Our happiness is limited. We suffer physically, we suffer emotionally, we inflict suffering upon others. But all of that is the effect of choosing something other than God. At this point, did his carnal actions slow down or stop? Well, that is a good question then to bring us into Book 8. Augustine is ready for this transformation, but not quite there yet. So we'll move on. Book 8, opening line. In a spirit of thankfulness, let me recall the mercies you have lavished on me, O my God. To you, let me confess them. May I be flooded with love for you until my very bones cry out, who is like you, O Lord? He has all of his beliefs lined up, but it's one thing to believe something to be true. It's another to actually be able to implement that in your life. And that's where Augustine is right now. What I longed for was not greater certainty about you, but a more steadfast abiding in you. My daily life, everything seemed to be teetering, and my heart needed to be cleansed of the old leaven. I was attracted to the way, which is our Savior himself, but the narrowness of the path daunted me, and I still could not walk in it. And I'm going to go ahead and assume that is an experience everyone can personally relate to, which is why Confessions is a perennial favorite, because Augustine being so raw about his own emotionally crippled state. We all are to some extent, greater or lesser, but we all are spiritual cripples in some way. And the idea of trying to use sheer willpower to get through that makes the problem worse. He's attracted to the way, but he's daunted. You inspired in me that I ought to go to this Simplicianus. And even I could see the sense of this. I regarded him as your good servant, a man from whom grace radiated. So Simplicianus, an old Christian, we don't know exactly how. He's the one that we'll find out through his conversation is present for the conversion of Marius Victorinus, who does the translations of the books that Augustine read in the previous book, the Book of the Platonist. He's the one, when Ambrose is made Bishop of Milan, Simplicianus is the one who basically teaches him what it is to be a priest, what it is to be a bishop. He actually outlived Ambrose, and Ambrose dies in the 390s, and Simplicianus then is Bishop of Milan for just a few years after that. Simplicianus is the one that Augustine goes to. Simplicianus, outside of Confessions, is the one that writes to him with those questions about grace. What Augustine talks about at the end of Confession 7, that necessity of grace that was totally lacking in philosophy. That's the idea that Simplicianus finds a way of sort of, nailing into his head. So while Augustine wants all of these things, in 2, we go through everything that's holding him back. He's irked by the secular business he's conducting. He's a teacher of rhetoric. But he no longer wants the goals of being good at rhetoric, which are reputation and wealth. He still has his inability to conquer lust. I was in tight bondage to a woman. This is the new woman, the one that he found basically to replace the mother of his child that he loved but had to send back to Africa while he's still waiting to marry the girl who's not quite of marriage age. And then he includes, the apostle did not forbid me to marry, although he did propose a better choice, earnestly wishing that everyone might live as he himself did. But I was too weak for that and inclined to an easier course. For this reason alone, I was vacillating, bored and listless amid my shriveled cares, because I was forced to adapt myself to other aspects of conjugal life to which I had pledged and constrained myself, though they were little to my liking. From the lips of your truth, I had heard that there are eunuchs who have castrated themselves for the love of the kingdom of heaven. But the saying continues, let anyone accept this who can. Augustine's clearly not able to do that yet. And he brings us to this fantastic conclusion. I had found a precious pearl worth buying at the cost of all I had, but I went on hesitating. He's so prepared. He knows what will bring him happiness, but he can't commit himself to that. Accordingly, I made my way to Simplicianus. When Ambrose, then bishop, had been baptized, Simplicianus had stood as father to him, and Ambrose regarded him with affection as a father indeed. To him I described my winding path of wayward life. When I mentioned that I had read certain Platonist books translated by Victorinus, who had formerly been a rhetorician at Rome, and Victorinus would have been like a role model to early Augustine. Victorinus was such a famed teacher of rhetoric that he had a statue to put up in Rome. But he'd heard that Victorinus died a Christian. Simplicianus told me how fortunate I was not to have stumbled on the writings of other philosophers, whereas those Platonist writings conveyed in every possible way, albeit indirectly, the truth of God and his word. And so you have this moment where he goes to Simplicianus, the man who was working with the Victorinus who did all these translations, and Augustine tells him he's been reading these books translated by Victorinus. It's, again, one of those things where you either see the grace of God working, or you have to believe in a sense of random luck that's just absurd. So he goes over the story of Victorinus, including the point of all of this, that humility of Christ, which is hidden from the sagacious, but revealed to the little ones. So basically the story here is Victorinus is brilliant. He's one of those people who actually read all the Liberals and understood them, the way Augustine had criticized so many for not understanding. He instructs the senators, the highest aristocratic class in Rome. The statue had been erected to him in the Forum. The elderly Victorinus had habitually defended the cults of the ancient gods, the ones that are now dying in favor. Yet he was not ashamed to become a child of your Christ and to be born as an infant from your font, bending his neck to the yoke of humility. So this great teacher of rhetoric, who throughout all of his life had defended the Roman ways. He had been a worshiper of idols and shared the abominable superstitions. This man is willing to bow his neck and accept Christ. Victorinus was in the habit of reading Holy Scripture, section 4, and intensively studying all the Christians' writings, which he subjected to close scrutiny. And he would say to Simplicianus, not openly, but in private, intimate conversation, I am already a Christian, you know. But Simplicianus always replied, I will not believe that, nor count you among Christians until I see you in Christ's church. Victorinus would then chafe him. It's walls that make Christians then? He would often talk like this, claiming that he was a Christian. He doesn't want to ruin his reputation. And remember, at this point in time, the pagans are still the majority in Rome. The intellectual groups are the Neoplatonists, even the Manichaeans. The Christians do not yet have the level, at least amongst the old guard Romans. They don't have the social respectabilities. So Victorinus accepts Christianity, but he doesn't want to publicly be seen with it. The fact was that he was sorely afraid of upsetting the proud demon worshippers who were his friends. Later, he drank in courage from his avid reading and came to fear that he might be disowned by Christ before his holy angels if he feared to confess him before men and women. So Simplicianus likes what he reads in the Gospels, but he doesn't want to fully accept it because he doesn't want to make that social change. But then he comes across the lines in the Gospels of, don't be ashamed of Christ. In his own eyes, he was guilty of a great crime in being ashamed of the holy mysteries instituted by your humble word, while feeling no shame at the sacrilegious rites of proud demons, whose likeness he had been proud to assume himself. So Victorinus himself has, similar to Augustine, this moment of the fractured self where he wants to believe in Christianity, but the social question of accepting Christianity leads him to continue to associate himself with the cult, this demonic cult that he sees in the pagan religion. And this is so great that he threw off the shamefaced provoked by vanity and became modest in the face of truth. Suddenly and without warning, he said to Simplicianus, who told this tale, let us go to church. I want to become a Christian. So Simplicianus takes him to church, puts him into the first stage of the catechumenate. And then not long afterwards, he stands in baptism. Rome stood amazed while the church was jubilant. And then we have a detail here about something that the church had done for men like Victorinus. Simplicianus told me that Victorinus had been offered by the priest the option of making his statement more privately, for it was customary to offer this concession to people who were likely to lose their nerve through shyness, but that he had chosen rather to proclaim his salvation before the Holy Company. The fear that somebody had put all of this time and sincerity into wanting to be Christian, but in that last moment, they wouldn't publicly be able to make that announcement. They offered them a more private ceremony. But Victorinus, because of his specific sin, acknowledges that he needs to do this publicly. If he was not afraid to address crowds of crazy people in his own words, how much less ought he to fear your peaceable flock as he uttered your word? And then there are going to be more stories of translations that Augustine comes across in Book 8. And his response is great, but not quite enough. On hearing this story, I was fired to imitate Victorinus. Indeed, it was to this end that your servant Simplicianus had related it. But he added a further point. When in the reign of the Emperor Julian, Julian was the last of the pagan emperors. He was in Constantine's family, but he wanted to go back to Roman paganism. So he's known as Julian the Apostate. And Julian did everything he could to revive the pagan religion. And there's a fantastic letter of his that's recorded where he's begging the pagan priests to act better because they're losing face to the Christian priests that are so much more holy and actually helping people. When in the reign of the Emperor Julian, a law was passed which forbade Christians to teach literature and rhetoric, Victorinus willingly complied, for he preferred to abandon his school of talkativeness rather than forsake your word, through which you impart eloquence to the tongues of speechless babes. In my eyes, he appeared so much not heroic as all the happier for having taken the step, since afforded him the opportunity to be at leisure for you. I ached for a like chance myself, for it was no iron chain imposed by anyone else that fettered me, but the iron of my own will. The truth is that my disordered lust springs from a perverted will. When lust is pandered to, a habit is formed. When habit is not checked, it hardens into compulsion. And so the two wills fought it out. So he hears the story of Victorinus, and he sees Victorinus basically threatened with his job, which gives him the opportunity to reject his public life and to go into Christian seclusion. Augustine wishes he had something like that for himself, but he recognizes how long his habit of it, by going into this vice, he's formed a habit, and that habit is incredibly hard to break. And so he has those two wills fighting it out. The next story that he hears is a conversation with Pontitianus. Pontitianus is another man, he's well known in the court. He's in this upper class political sphere. So he's something like what Augustine had one day hoped of being. And he comes to visit Augustine at the house where he and Alypius are staying, because Pontitianus is from North Africa as well. So they have, this shared ethnicity, this shared connection. We sat down together and talked in their house. His eyes happened to light upon a book that lay on a gaming table nearby. And so you have Augustine's old and new ways there, the gaming table of the public teacher of rhetoric, the pagan, and then the book that's there. He picked it up, opened it, and found it to be the letters of the Apostle Paul. So those letters of Paul that Augustine has been reading, Pontitianus picks those up. And Augustine has this moment of thinking that he's going to be mocked for this. But instead, Pontitianus smiles and offers congratulations, that those are the particular writings in front of him. And Augustine explains this, and Pontitianus launches into a story about the monk Antony of Egypt. So this life of Antony of Egypt, so Antony is living in the 3rd century, so about 100 years before all of this. And his life is written down by Athanasius of Alexandria. Antony of Egypt is the beginning of monasticism. And so the story of Antony of Egypt, as recorded by Athanasius of Alexandria, becomes incredibly popular. Antony is the one who hears that line. He comes across that gospel line: take everything you have and sell it and give to the poor. And he takes that literally. He lives a life of absolute asceticism in the desert. And for the searchers like Augustine, who are struggling with this Roman society, the idea of simply abandoning this society to be able to spend your life in praise of God is incredibly attractive. And Augustine has to admit that he's never even heard of it. When Pontitianus learned of this, he dwelt more fully on the subject, enlightening us about the great man. He was astonished at our ignorance. But we were stupefied as we listened to the tale of the wonders you had worked within the true faith of the Catholic Church, especially as they were most firmly attested by recent memory and had occurred so near our own times. So all of us were amazed. We, because they were so tremendous, and he, because we had never heard of them. And that fantastic bit where the miracles wrought by Antony in the desert, Augustine is just floored by these, and Pontitianus is floored that somebody of Augustine's learning and background had never read the life of Antony. And that launches Pontitianus into a story of another conversion. It came about, we're in 15, that he told us that one day when the court was set at Trier, and Trier is in the Rhine Valley, it was basically it was the major Roman capital for the province that guarded the border with against the Germanic tribes. Ambrose was from Trier. It ends up becoming a huge power center because those are some of the most important legions in the entire army, keeping the barbarians on the other side of the Rhine. So while Pontitianus is at Trier, he and 3 of his colleagues went out for a walk in the gardens along the wall, while the emperor was occupied with the morning show at the circus. It happened as they strolled about, they split into pairs, one companion staying with Pontitianus, while the other 2 went off by themselves. In their wanderings, they chanced upon a cottage where some servants of yours were living, men poor in spirit, the kind of people to whom the kingdom of heaven belongs. There they found a book which contained the life of Antony. And these 2 men, these 2 court officials, begin to read. And they're overwhelmed by what they read in this. And they read of the happiness, not the cheap worldly happiness, but the sincere inner joy that Antony has while literally fighting demons in the desert. And admiration and enthusiasm are around. And as he read, he began to mull over the possibility of appropriating the same kind of life for himself by renouncing the secular career to serve you alone. He belonged to the rank of the administrative officers. The administrative officers would have included the secret police and spies for the emperor. They had their job to basically go around and see who was being loyal and who wasn't. Quite suddenly, he was filled with a love of holiness and a realistic sense of shame and disgust with himself. He turned his gaze toward his friend and demanded, "Tell me, where do we hope all our efforts are going to get us? What are we looking for? In whose cause are we striving? Does life at the court promise us anything better than promotion to being friends of the emperor?" So friends of the emperor is basically a designation that you're in the inner circle. That's the best that they can hope for. And once we are, will that not be a precarious position fraught with perils? Will it not mean negotiating many a hazard, only to end in greater danger still? And how long would it take us to get there? So to go as far as they can go, to be named friends of the emperor, doesn't mean that life suddenly becomes easy. It means it becomes way more complicated. The intrigue around the emperor, the intrigue around all of the friends of the emperor, you can assume that there's going to be people that absolutely hate you, that might murder you, that will defame you, that will do anything they can to have the emperor no longer trust you. That's the best that they can hope for. If they go as far as they can, they have a life of constant peril ahead of them. And that's if they work and everything works out great. Whereas I can become a friend of God here and now if I want to. And that fantastic ability that this unnamed convert has, that Pontitianus tells us about, or that Pontitianus tells Augustine about, and that Augustine shares with us, to distill all of this down to its very basic. How hard do we work in our secular career to go further and further and further? Do we ever find actual happiness there, or do the complications increase the more successful that we become? What is the point of all of this striving if we never actually get that rest that we're looking for? Whereas I can become a friend of God here and now if I want to. Even as he spoke, he was in labor with a new life that was struggling to birth within him. He directed his eyes back to the page, and as he read, a change began to occur in that hidden place within him, where you alone can see. His mind was being stripped of the world, as presently became apparent. The flood tide of his heart leapt on, and at last he broke off his reading with a groan as he discerned the right course and determined to take it. By now he belonged to you. I've already torn myself away from the ambitions we cherished and have made up my mind to serve God, he told his friend. I am going to set about it this very moment and in this place. If you have no stomach to imitate me, at least don't stand in my way. The other replied that he would bear him company, both in the noble reward and in the glorious combat. And both of them, now enlisted in your service, began to build their tower, knowing the cost full well. They abandoned all their possessions and followed you. And so Augustine hears this story of these men who were successful, but have this one moment where they're called to God, and they are able in that moment to respond with wholehearted commitment. They drop their life behind completely and they dedicate themselves. I can become a friend of God here and now if I want to. And Augustine hears this story, what he's been holding back on for so long. Pontitianus and his companions shed tears on their account, as he related, even though they were in no way altered from the men they had been. They offered devout congratulations to their friends and commended themselves to their prayers. Then they went back to the palace, dragging heavy hearts along the ground, while their friends stayed in the cottage with hearts set on heaven. So the two friends become Christians, Pontitianus and the other are happy for them, but they go back to court. Both were engaged to be married, and when their fiancés later heard of their decision, they likewise dedicated their virginity to you. Even the marriage that was set up for them is something that works out for the greater glory of God. The brides-to-be decide to make their full commitment as well. And at this point, with Augustine hearing this story, we'll take our final break for questions. And as there's nothing up in chat, I'll go over the other questions that I had from email. And this actually came from last week. There's a question about Augustine's earlier life. If he was so promiscuous, why didn't he have illegitimate children everywhere? Maybe he did, but we don't know. Did they have birth control of some sort other than withdrawal? So Augustine's promiscuity, once he meets the mother of Adeodatus' son, he's faithful to her until he dismisses her. Before that, we get the sense that Augustine has engaged in intercourse with some women, but he's also making up quite a bit to his friends so as not to seem like the awkward one there. So his promiscuity, it is within certain bounds. In the classical world, birth control was very widely practiced. Both physical methods of birth control, there was an early form of condoms that they have putting of inserting certain compounds into the woman that would be spermicidal. And abortion was a last case resort that was very widespread in the ancient world. Many women died of that as well, of course, since this is before any kind of hygienic practices of any kind. And abortion's mentioned all the way back in the Didache in like AD 70. The church was always opposed to it. It was always seen as a great sin. There's a reference, I can't remember exactly where, that a 10-year public penance was required for a Christian who either had or insisted on someone else having one. And it was Christianity alone that ended the infanticide in general, but specifically the infanticide of girls, and that also ended abortion as a accepted practice in the ancient world. Oh, and then the further question about Pelagius, free will, and destination. There's the question involved whether Augustine was misinterpreting lines from St. Paul's letter to the Romans 5:12, and that he kind of invented the idea of original sin. So I'm not going to talk about Augustine's interpretation of St. Paul. I am not a biblical scholar. I don't read the original Greek for that, which would be absolutely necessary for that question. Augustine certainly doesn't invent the idea of original sin. He gives it a form and a strength that it didn't have before, because it didn't need to be defended as stridently before, because there wasn't anybody attacking it the way that Pelagius did. Pelagius's suggestion that you can do everything through will and that sin is just a personal thing meant that infants didn't have to be baptized. And since Augustine is insisting upon the original sin, this has always been taught, he's the one that really insists on the practice of infant baptism. Part of his own experience where he wasn't baptized and he could have died young probably has quite a bit to do with the insistence that he has that everyone be baptized. The question of how he's interpreting St. Paul, that's one that I'm going to leave to biblical theologians. I'm just not frankly qualified to answer that question. But the debate with Pelagius is a clear one, because Pelagius's thinking basically is that it's every man for himself and you can just will yourself into goodness. So it's sort of a Christian Iron Man competition, I guess we could say. So Augustine is fascinating because he draws a lot of criticism for being harsh and condemnatory, but Augustine's notion of grace is far more infused with love than Pelagius's notion of the supremacy of will. Okay, and with that, we'll get into our final section where we get the actual conversion. So 16, Pontitianus went on with his story, but Lord, even while he spoke, you were wrenching me back toward myself. And we think about those lines earlier where Augustine talks about his sin as a wandering, but he doesn't describe it as himself wandering from the Lord. He describes it as himself wandering from himself. That sin in choosing something other than God not only divides us from God, it divides us from our very selves. Our truest identity is that of a child of God. And when we don't act that way, the result necessarily is suffering that takes the form of fragmentation. So here, Augustine is coming back to wholeness, wrenching me back toward myself, pulling me round from that standpoint behind my back, which I had taken to avoid looking at myself. And the brutal honesty of where Augustine was, that intellectual posturing that he had created to avoid having to really evaluate himself and what he was doing. You set me down before my face, forcing me to mark how despicable I was, how misshapen and begrimed, filthy and festering. I saw and shuddered. If I tried to turn my gaze away, he went on relentlessly telling his tale. And you set me before myself once more, thrusting me into my sight that I might perceive my sin and hate it. There's a line that Augustine used earlier when he was talking about one of the sects that he no longer followed. He used that phrase, perfect hatred. And what he means by perfect hatred, though, is that you avoid both of the extremes of hatred. There's, perfect hatred is love the sinner, hate the sin. And the mistakes that you can make are hating both the sin and the sinner, where you get into self-righteous vengeance, but then also, well, we're more guilty of in the modern world, loving the sin on account of loving the sinner, where we try to gloss over the sin and explain it away as not really being all that bad. And that's what Augustine had been doing for 10 years, is looking at himself, and he comes up with the Manichaean excuse for why he's not able to overcome his lust. As he's wanting to follow Christ, he still can't quite do that. So now, as Pontitianus is telling this tale of this Roman administrator who has this religious awakening and fully commits to it in that moment. Um, this story forces Augustine to look at himself and his own actions and perceive his own sin and hate that sin. I had been aware of it all along, but I had been glossing over it, suppressing it, and forgetting. Now self-abhorrence possessed me, and all the harsher as my heart went out more ardently to those young men, the young men who were able to respond immediately. And I heard of the blessed impulsiveness with which they had, without reserve, handed themselves over to you for healing. The immediacy there is what punches Augustine more than anything. By contrast with them, I felt myself loathsome, remembering how many of my years, 12 perhaps, had gone to waste, and I with them, since my 19th year, when I was aroused to pursue wisdom by the reading of Cicero's Hortensius. 12 years he claims that he set this as his goal, but he can't make that final step. I had been putting off the moment when, spurring earthly happiness, I would clear space in my life to search for wisdom. Yet even to seek it, let alone to find it, would have been more rewarding than discovery of treasure or possession of all this world's kingdoms, or having every bodily pleasure at my beck and call. I had been miserable in my adolescence, miserable from its very onset. And as I prayed to you for the gift of chastity, I had even pleaded in that most famous Augustine prayer, grant me chastity and self-control, but please not yet. Sed noli modo is the Latin there. Noli is a verb that means not, but it literally means I would not have it so. Sed noli modo means, but I don't want this quite yet. I was afraid that you might hear me immediately and heal me forthwith of my morbid lust, which I was more anxious to satisfy than to snuff out. So I'd wandered off into the crooked paths of a sacrilegious superstition, not because I had any certainty about it, but because I preferred it to other beliefs. Not that I was investigating these in any spirit of reverence, rather I was opposing them with malicious intent. So he has all of these excuses for following these paths that he knows won't bring him happiness, because he doesn't want to confront his own lust. He doesn't want to give up that habit. Grant me chastity, but not yet. I'd been telling myself that the reason for putting off day after day the decision to renounce worldly ambition and to follow you alone was that I could as yet see no certain light by which to steer my course. So he wants that certainty that he goes searching for in philosophy. But the day had dawned when I was stripped naked in my own eyes, and my conscience challenged me within. Where is your ready tongue now? You've been professing yourself reluctant to throw off your load of illusion because truth was uncertain. Well, it is certain now, yet the burden still weighs you down, while other people are given wings on freer shoulders. People who have not worn themselves out with research, nor spent a decade or more reflecting on these questions. And so Augustine finally has to confront himself. He has to acknowledge that the 12 years of searching was a lie. He had an interest in wisdom, but what he really wanted was to delay, to put off the cleansing of himself that he knew was necessary. And after hearing these stories, he can't put off that question anymore. My conscience gnawed away at me in this fashion, and I was fiercely shamed and flung into hideous confusion while Pontitianus was relating all of this. Having brought the conversation to a close and settled his business, he returned to his place and I to mine. And now Augustine's left, not by himself, he's still with Alypius, but delightful bit of Augustine where he's literally never alone. And the odd thing that we have, like that image of Augustine where he's so unforgiving and rigid, is totally at odds with all of the reality that we have of historical Augustine, where he always has people around him. Someone morose and unforgiving would never have attracted the lifelong friends who move all over the empire to be with him, as was the case with Augustine throughout his entire life. Within the house of my spirit, the violent conflict raged on. 19. The quarrel with my soul that I had so powerfully provoked in our secret dwelling, my heart. And at the height of it, I rushed to Alypius with mental anguish playing on my face. What is happening to us? I exclaimed. What does this mean? What did you make of it? The untaught are rising up and taking heaven by storm, while we, with all our dispassionate teachings, are so groveling in this world of flesh and blood. Are we ashamed to follow just because they have taken the lead, yet not ashamed of lacking the courage even to follow? And just the inner contradictions that he's recognizing in his own life. We're ashamed to follow them because we're more educated by them, but we're not ashamed to lack the courage to even follow them. And so Augustine goes through this torment. Adjacent to our lodgings was a small garden. We were free to make use of it as well as of the house, for our host who owned the house did not live there. So they're friends with a rich person who has, like a third or fourth home, one in the capital, one in places that aren't the capital. And Augustine gets to use that. And, still what you'll find in, those parts of Italy are small gardens for these finer houses. The tumult in my breast had swept me to this place where no one would interfere with the blazing dispute I had engaged in with myself until it should be resolved. What the outcome would be, you knew, not I. All I knew was that I was going mad, but for the sake of my sanity and dying that I might live, aware of the evil that I was, but unaware of the good I was soon to become. So all of this fragmentation and suffering comes to a head in this one moment. I went out into the garden, and Alypius followed at my heels. My privacy was not infringed by his presence, and in any case, how could he abandon me in that state? We sat down as far as possible from the house. I was groaning in spirit and shaken by violent anger, because I could form no resolve to enter into a covenant with you, though in my bones I knew that this is what I ought to do. And everything in me lauded such a course to the skies. It was a journey not to be undertaken by ship or carriage or on foot. Nor need it take me even that short distance I had walked from the house to the place we were sitting, for to travel and more to reach journey's end was nothing else but to want to go there. And we come to this question that Augustine has a will, but that will isn't perfect. He has to will himself to want this. What the philosophers would call the second order volition. You don't just want something, but you want yourself to want to do something. That phrase, that state where everybody is as they're trying to improve their lives or get rid of a bad habit. And he goes over in 20 that he's basically going through convulsions as he's dealing with this. So then there were plenty of actions that I performed where willing was not the same thing as being able. Yet I was not doing the one thing that was incomparably more desirable to me, the thing that I would have been able to do as soon as I willed. Because as soon as I willed, why then I would be willing it. For in this sole instance, the faculty to act and the will to act precisely coincide, and the willing is already doing. And what he's talking about here is, for everything else in your life, to want to do something and to physically be able to do it are two different things. But here he's simply wanting to commit, which requires no physical action whatsoever. All it requires is that the will be pure, but the will as yet isn't pure. So the sole instance where willing and doing something are the same thing, that's what he can't overcome. My body was ready to obey the slightest whim of my soul in the matter of moving my limbs, then my soul was to obey its own command in carrying out this major volition, which was to be accomplished within the will alone. The mind commands the body and is instantly obeyed. The mind commands itself and meets with resistance. As I say, the mind commands itself to will something. It would not be giving the order if it did not want this thing, yet it does not do what it commands. He still has that fragmentation, these wills pulling him in different directions. He doesn't have the wholeness, and that wholeness that one can only find in returning to God. Evidently, then, it does not want this thing with the whole of itself, and therefore the command does not proceed from an undivided mind. That state again, the division. Inasmuch as it issues the command, it does will it, but inasmuch as the command is not carried out, it does not will it. What the will is ordering is that a certain volition should exist. And this volition is not some alien thing, but its very self. Hence, it cannot be giving the order with its whole self. And this is where he is. He wants to commit, but not entirely. This partial willing and partial non-willing is thus not so bizarre, but a sickness of the mind which cannot rise with its whole self on the wings of truth, because it is heavily burdened by habit. There are two wills then, and neither is whole. What one has, the other lacks. And so then he's going to go into a long discussion about the will. And Augustine, this is a question that he comes back to again and again. I made that comment about the medieval line that, somebody's read all of Augustine, was a phrase that they would use of an intellectual who claimed to have done far more than he actually had. Augustine writes nonstop. From about this moment on the garden until he dies in 430, it seems he's always dictating something. There is the New City Press, I think that's the name of it, in New York, that has been trying to put all of Augustine into English translation. They started the project in 1992. They're not quite finished yet. They're at 44 volumes. But of the volumes that Augustine would write later on, the question of he'll have works on the free will, on the will itself, on psychology, how it is that our mind works, how it is that our will works. It's something that he's never going to cease to be fascinated by. When I was making up my mind to serve the Lord my God at last, as I'd long since purposed, I was the one who wanted to follow that course, and I was the one who wanted not to. I was the only one involved. I neither wanted it wholeheartedly nor turned from it wholeheartedly. I was at odds with myself and fragmenting myself. This disintegration was occurring without my consent. But what it indicated was not the presence of me of a mind belonging to some alien nature, but the punishment undergone by my own. And that's what we get with the sense of sin as suffering, evil as the necessary result of sin. The fragmentation of his will is part of his will wants to return to God, but part of his will wants to try to continue to find happiness in physical pleasure. In this sense, and in this sense only, it was not I who brought it about, but the sin that dwelt within me, as penalty for that other sin committed with greater freedom, for I was a son of Adam. And so what he's saying here, he says that it's the sin that dwells in him, but he's making it very clear that's not to be understood in a Manichaean sense as something physically wrong with his body. It's what he has habituated himself to through continual sin. As penalty for that other sin committed with greater freedom, the sin of Adam, whereby all humanity is marked with original sin. All humanity lacks the ability to have that clarity that he's looking for now. And then he goes into a question of the wills and an argument against the Manichees. And we'll notice, once he accepts Christianity, one of the very first books that he writes is against the Manichees. And this is written after he's written that work, but he recognizes how seductive the Manichaean doctrine is, and he wants to make sure that others don't follow down that seductive path and end up being trapped as he were. Skipping ahead then to 25, such was the sickness in which I agonized, blaming myself more sharply than ever, turning and twisting in my chain as I strove to tear free from it completely. For slender indeed was the bond that still held me, but hold me it did. In my secret heart you stood by me, Lord, redoubling the lashes of fear and shame in the severity of your mercy, lest I give up the struggle that the slender, fragile bond that remained be not broken after all, but thicken again and constrict more tightly. The anguish, the suffering that Augustine is experiencing here is a gift of God. It's this suffering that's going to help him finally break that chain of sin, the habit of sin, rather than have that be made stronger through this. Let it be now, I was saying to myself, now is the moment. Let it be now. And merely by saying this, I was moving towards that decision. All of that tomorrow from the last lecture. They make me chase, but not now. Sed noli modo. All of that's gone. He wishes it now. I would almost achieve it, but then fall just short. He wants, and he's not saying that he has the purity of will right now, but he wants to have that purity of will now. Previously, he didn't even want that to happen right now. I would make a fresh attempt, similar to what we saw in book 7, where he makes that attempt at Neoplatonic ecstasy. And I was almost there, almost there. I was not touching the goal, grasping it. I shrank from dying to death and living to life for ingrained evil. And here it's that ingrained evil as the result of continual choices. For ingrained evil was more powerful in me than new grafted good. And this, I mean, everybody who has ever tried to break a bad habit knows this. How immediately easy it is to fall back into that habit, how hard it is to sustain the new good habit. The nearer it came, the moment when I would be changed, the more it pierced me with terror. Dismayed, but not quite dislodged, I was left hanging. And so now he goes into this inner psychic drama where he hears the personified the voice of his old habits. Do you mean to get rid of us? Shall we never be your companions again after that moment? Never again? From that time onward, so-and-so will be forbidden to you all your life. And what was it they were reminding me of by those words, so-and-so? Oh my God, what were they bringing to mind? May your mercy banish such memories far from me. What foul deeds were they not hinting at? What disgraceful exploits? But now their voices were less than half as loud. The taunts had begun to sound much less persuasive, 27. For a revelation was coming to me from that country towards which I was facing, but into which I trembled to cross. There I beheld the chaste, dignified figure of continence. It's not enough to wish to stop doing evil. You have to actively embrace virtue. Part of the ancient wisdom that modern psychology has finally gotten around to verifying. You can't ever really break a habit, you can only replace it. Vice, that is the habit of sin, can't be done away with. It has to be replaced by the practice of virtue. And what Augustine had been trying to do up to this point is just get rid of something negative, but not replace it with something positive. And in this moment now, he sees goodness. I beheld the chaste, dignified figure of continence. Calm and cheerful was her manner, though modest, pure and honorable her charm, as she coaxed me to come and hesitate no longer, stretching kindly hands to welcome and embrace me. She was smiling at me, but with a challenging smile, as though to say, can you not do what these men have done? These women, could any of them achieve it by their own strength without the Lord their God? He it was, the Lord their God, who granted me to them. Why try to stand by yourself, only to lose your footing? Cast yourself on him and do not be afraid. He will not step back and let you fall. Cast yourself upon him trustfully. He will support and heal you. And what we have here is sort of the flip side of another one of Augustine's insights, that sin is a turning away from God. It's a rejection of God's grace. It's a rejection of God's love. But what it also rejects is vulnerability. To accept God's love requires that vulnerability that Augustine wasn't capable of, the humility of depending on someone else rather than the self. And the habit of sin, even when we know that sin won't bring us joy, the habit of sin has perhaps its greatest support in the notion of, this is mine. This is me. I'm not dependent on anybody else. This is my own. And the relationship with God can never be that way. The relationship with God requires us to trust him. Trust requires vulnerability. It requires vulnerability not in the sense that God will harm us, but in the sense that we have to put down the defensive measures that we have against everything else. We have to be willing to embrace completely. Absolute commitment holds nothing back. And to hold nothing back is by definition to make you vulnerable. The etymology of vulnerable, the Latin vulnus, vulnerable, vulnera means wound. That which is vulnerable is that which makes itself able to be wounded. Cast yourself upon him trustfully, he will support and heal you. Augustine has to give up everything that is just his. All of these forms of protection, the perverse delight in what you have that is completely your own. And what you have completely your own is sin. But the willingness to cast yourself upon God trustfully. For somebody who struggles with humility, that's an issue. And I was bitterly ashamed because I could still hear the murmur of those frivolities. And I was still in suspense, still hanging back. And the conversation in his head continues. By these, as the voices in the head continue on, for by these I was conscious of being held prisoner. I uttered cries of misery. Why must I go on saying tomorrow, tomorrow? Why not now? Why not put an end to my depravity this very hour? And what Augustine's describing here now, it's not just literary conceit. Psychologists and therapists that deal with addiction, they have a phrase of describing the inner life of the addict as the conversation. That one who has handed themselves over to vice, to the habit of sin, the fragmentation is very real. And the different parts of their mind that are calling out different things are very real. The sense that they do not have a whole unity is very real. So Augustine is dramatizing this to a certain extent, but the sense of fragmentation, that is what those who've been through that experience can recognize the clearest, perhaps, in this part. I went on talking like this and weeping in the intense bitterness of my broken heart. So there is no resolution. Suddenly I heard a voice from a house nearby, perhaps a voice of some boy or girl I do not know, singing over and over again, pick it up and read, pick it up and read. And it's hard to translate the Latin here, tolle lege, tolle lege. Just two simple verbs in the imperative form. Take and read, perhaps. Tolle lege, pick it up and read. My expression immediately altered, and I began to think hard whether children ordinarily repeated a little ditty like this in any sort of game. And I mean, there's almost a comedy to this, that he's hearing this voice and he feels he's going mad to a certain extent, but he also feels that he's heard the voice of God before. And before he takes this as a divine injunction, he's going through all of his memory to see, is this a childhood song that it might just be some child singing? And he can't think of it. Believing this could be nothing other than a divine command to open the book and read the first passage I chanced upon. Sortilege is the name of this. For I had heard the story of how Antony had been instructed by a gospel text. He happened to arrive while the gospel was being read, and he took the words to be addressed to himself when he heard, go and sell all you possess and give the money to the poor. You will have treasure in heaven. Stung into action, I returned to the place where Alypius was sitting. For on leaving it, I had put down there the book of the Apostles' Letter, the book of Paul's letters that Pontitianus had been looking at the beginning of this episode. I snatched it and read in silence the passage on which my eyes first lighted. Not in dissipation and drunkenness, nor in debauchery and lewdness, nor in arguing and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh or the gratification of your desires. I had no wish to read further, nor was there need. The light of certainty flooded my heart. Alypius witnesses what's happening. And then Alypius, in return, told me what had been happening to him without my knowledge. He asked to see what I had read. I showed him, but he looked further than my reading had taken. I did not know what followed, but the next verse was, make room for the person who is weak in faith. he referred this text to himself and interpreted it to me. And we remember from the way that Augustine had described Alypius before, he loved Alypius in that classical sense of friendship as love of virtue in another. That Alypius had the continence that Augustine wished for himself. Alypius had tried out the world of lust and didn't care for it, and was able to live continently in a way that Augustine could not understand. And then he looks after the verse that Augustine has just cited, and he finds one that he has to take as directed at himself. Confirmed by this admonition, he associated himself with my decision and good purpose without any upheaval or delay, for it was entirely in harmony with his own moral character, which for a long time had now been far, far better than mine. We went indoors and told my mother, who was overjoyed. When we related to her, and we find out now, only now, that his mother has been inside throughout this entire emotional torment that Augustine's been going through. When we related to her how it had happened, she was filled with triumphant delight and blessed you, who have power to do more than we ask or understand, for she saw that you had granted her much more in my regard than she had been wont to beg of you in her wretched, tearful groaning. Many years earlier, you had shown her a vision of me standing on the rule of faith. And now indeed I stood there, no longer seeking a wife or entertaining any worldly hope, for you had converted me to yourself. In doing so, you had also converted her grief into a joy far more abundant than she had desired, and much more tender and chaste than she could have ever looked to find in grandchildren from my flesh. And with that, I think we'll end this week's lesson. If you have any questions, you can put those up right now. If you email me those, I will answer those next week. It seems kind of anticlimactic to do questions after that ending. So if it's all right with everybody, I would prefer just to end on this note. Thank you all very much for being here, and I look forward to seeing you next week.